This is Screencast 1 for Unit 1, Lesson 3. Okay? Um, Lesson 3 starts on page 32, and let's look at the essential question: how are scientific investigations conducted? Now, we've mentioned scientific investigations previously, that there were two main types: field studies and laboratory experiments. Okay, but now we're going to look into how exactly do we do these. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to summarize the processes and characteristics of different kinds of scientific investigations. Just a reminder, you need to make sure that you begin answering the questions at number 1 on page 33, because that is part of the assignment for Lesson 3. All right, let's look at page 34. On page 34, it says, what are some parts that make up scientific investigations? Okay. An experiment is an organized procedure to study something under controlled conditions. That would be similar to the ramp height versus the speed of the car. That was an experiment that we did. Okay. So scientists often investigate the natural world through experiments. Scientists also learn about the natural world through observations. Observation is the process of getting information by using the senses. Okay. For instance, when we did our field study, we didn't take everything into the lab. We just went outside and we made observations about what was happening with the traffic. All right. Under elements of investigations, the red heading says hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable idea or explanation that can be used to plan a scientific investigation. A scientist may think of a hypothesis after making observations or after reading about other scientists' investigations. Hypotheses must be carefully constructed so they can be tested in a practical and scientifically sound way. Okay, I'm going to let you read the rest of that by yourself, okay, but be sure that you're answering the questions as you go through and actively read, because remember, I'm not reading everything to you. All right, look at page 35, independent and dependent variables. Scientists can control conditions in experiments. Okay, for instance, a laboratory experiment like the one that we did for ramp height and car speed. A variable is any factor that can change in a scientific investigation. There are two types of variables. An independent variable is the factor that is deliberately changed in an investigation. The dependent variable changes as a result of changes to the independent variable. Okay, so if you'll go back and think about the ramp height, car speed investigation that we did, the independent variable was the thing that we changed on purpose, and that was the height of the ramp. The dependent variable was the speed of the car, because the speed of the car changed as a result of what we did to the other variable. Okay? So it says, imagine you want to test the hypothesis that the intensity of heat under a pot of water determines how fast the water boils. You fill 3 pots with the same amount of water and then heat them until the water boils. The independent variable is the amount of heat that you supply, and the dependent variable is the time it takes for the water to boil. Okay? Down at the next paragraph, if possible, an experiment should have just one independent variable. Scientists try to keep other variables constant or unchanged, so they do not affect results. For example, in the experiment described above, all the pots are constants. So for instance, you would want to use the same pot for all 3 containers, or the same type of, the identical type of pot. Okay. In our car experiment, even though we were sort of unable to do this because the cars were not in that great a shape, we really should have the same or identical cars being used the whole time for all laboratory stations, but we weren't able to do that. Okay, so you want to keep everything constant except for the one variable that you are manipulating on purpose, so that you can see what it does to the dependent variable. All right, observations and data. Data are information and measurements gathered by experimentation that can be used in calculating or reasoning. Okay, down at the next paragraph. In an investigation, everything a scientist observes must be recorded. Okay. I'm now on page 36, looking at where it says many methods. What are some scientific methods? Well, first of all, you need to understand that the word method just refers to the way that you do something. Okay? Conducting experiments and other scientific investigations is not like following a cookbook recipe. Scientists do not always use the same steps in every investigation or use steps in the same order. They may even repeat some of the steps. Okay? So let's look at the graphic down here. And this shows you a possible plan as to how you might construct a scientific investigation. The first thing you're going to want to do is ask a well-defined question. Okay, so a scientific question must be well-defined or precisely stated so that it can be investigated. Then you're going to form a testable hypothesis and make predictions. So I'm just following the arrows and the red headlines. Okay? A hypothesis is a testable explanation that answers a scientific question. If it's not testable, you can't consider it a hypothesis. You've got to be able to test it. Okay? After you form a hypothesis, then you're going to plan an investigation. Okay? Scientists need to decide whether an investigation should be done in the field, as a field study, or in a laboratory, as a lab experiment. The next thing you're going to do is identify variables. So that's the next red heading, identifying variables. The dependent and independent variables of an experiment are identified in the hypothesis. So when you write your hypothesis, you need to say something about what you think is going to happen between the dependent and independent variables. Okay? Scientists need to decide how the independent variable will change, and they must identify other variables that will be controlled, meaning other things that could change that we're going to make sure that they don't. Then, after we identify variables, we are going to collect and organize data. After we collect and organize data, we're going to interpret the data and analyze information. So we're going to look at the data and kind of see what sort of information we can get from it. After we interpret data and analyze information, we're going to draw conclusions and defend those conclusions. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to go back and let you guys have a look at what I've highlighted. And so you get those ideas in your head and get those highlighted on your page. All right, this is what page 34 and 35 look like in my lesson. And I made sure that I highlighted the key points and underlined several vocabulary words that you need to pay attention to. Okay? I also highlighted and underlined the sentence that said, if possible, an experiment should have just one independent variable. That's very important to remember. All right, this is what my page 36 and 37 now look like. I highlighted the sentence that said scientists do not always use the same steps in every investigation or use steps in the same order. That's important to realize. Okay, and then I went through the diagram and reminded myself of the basic steps that you're going to use for a scientific investigation. Number 1 is ask a well-defined question. Number 2, form a testable hypothesis and make some predictions. Number 3, plan your investigation. Number 4, identify variables. Number 5, collect and organize data. Number 6, interpret data and analyze information. And number 7, draw conclusions.